Hi, everyone. My name is Charlie Beiruti. I'm in my fourth and final year of a PhD or DPhil in the history faculty here at Oxford. I'm studying and writing about 17th century English travellers to the Mughal and Ottoman empires. I'm particularly interested in Anglican clerics and what they made of the religious diversity of the societies they encountered. So what they made of not only Islam and various forms of Christianity, but also Judaism, and further east you had Zoroastrianism and Hinduism and Sikhism and so on, and a richly diverse religious landscape. And the source that we'll be looking at today is somewhat related to my interests. Comes from a slightly later period. This is a source from 18th century Iraq. It is an inventory or list detailing objects that were seized from a household of French Catholic missionaries residing in Baghdad during a raid by the authorities of the Ottoman Empire in 1701. So I suppose a little bit of context never hurts, though we don't need too much for this exercise. But at the time, Iraq was part of the Ottoman Empire. Its population was predominantly Muslim, though there were small minorities of Christians and Jews. So the inventory was compiled by one of the missionaries in Baghdad and was sent back to the missionary headquarters in France. As I say, you don't need to know anything about 18th century Iraq to analyze this source. We're going to be as spontaneous as possible. I always learn something at these sessions. It's a period with which I'm relatively familiar and a subject that I know fairly well, but certainly it's slightly later than the period I study, and in many ways I'm as much of a stranger to you. I'm as much of a stranger to it as you guys are too. We'll begin with a fairly straightforward question, perhaps a deceptively straightforward question. But what does this source tell us about the lives and the experiences of French missionaries in Baghdad in the 18th century? Does anyone want to begin? Sarah, yes. Did you want to begin?
Yeah, I was just going to say perhaps they had quite a good lifestyle, because it mentions that they had quite a lot of stuff that was embroidered in gold, so fine clothes, 40 pieces or so it said. So that kind of shows that their lifestyle there was quite of a high standard, because they had the money perhaps, or the resources to live like that.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to make a related point? Definitely, there's a real kind of there's a real sense of the richness of their environment in this source. They own objects of art, for instance. Did anyone else want to make a related point, or take us in another direction? Harry, do you want to step in?
Yeah, I think maybe building on that a little bit, what kind of struck me is kind of like almost the international element of it, or kind of there's a reference to kind of the East Indian Company in the East India Company. There's a reference to kind of this Turkish sword. There's a reference to Paris in there, and so kind of this kind of like other dimension kind of outside of the society that they're in, kind of influenced in it as well.
Definitely. Do we get any sense of how the of what the missionaries might be doing in Iraq? I mean, we're talking about how many objects they have, and do we get any sense of, and I'm open to both yes and no answers here, though I will ask you to expand, do we get any sense of the function of the missionaries in Iraq, or the function of these objects more specifically? What do you guys think? I think we've got Daniel, I think, and I know Charlotte. Charlotte, you had put your hand up initially, so I'll let you chip in.
I was just going to add that the kind of it kind of shows a material culture, and not really their true experience of living in Baghdad at the moment. So I think, although it's quite telling in the kind of materialistic wealth they had, it doesn't really give a holistic picture of their experience at the time, and especially I think as they got raided, it's quite interesting to see the kind of differences between what they could have had in terms of like their materialistic wealth. So, we're talking about or like the Turkish rugs and stuff like that. And in terms of the actual experience, I think they're two quite different things.
Yeah, definitely. So we're beginning to touch upon some of the limitations of this inventory, as a source.
Yeah.
It tells us a fair amount about sort of their material culture, but less about, say, perhaps their relations with local actors. Sarah, you had your hand up. Did you want to add something?
I was going to say, you can kind of tell a bit about their safety as well. The fact that they found rifles, pistols, swords kind of might indicate that they weren't always safe and they needed to have these things to protect themselves, which could kind of tell us a little bit about their relationship with the people there, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. Samuel, did you want to chip in? I don't think we've heard from you yet, so I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, I was also going to add, you can potentially also see something about their purpose from being there. The fact that they talk about furniture for use by traveling Franks who have nowhere else to stay, and also about stuff being left by Franks who are passing on their way back. So as well as, of course, being missionaries, it does seem that they're also some form of almost like a local place for people that are from France to be able to have some form of connect and to stay with, and that suggests that they are there for more than just maybe a religious spreading purpose.
Definitely, yeah, a sense of this missionary site as a way station, and for there's the French writer like Jean de Passage, like people passing through. I think there's a commercial element as well. I think you're absolutely right. I'm going to bring in, who haven't we heard from yet? Who has their hand up? I'm going to bring in. So I have to hover over each of your little icons, and then it brings up your name. Yeah, Alicia.
Yeah, I was just going to say I was quite struck by the reference to the surgical, medical, and mathematical instruments.
Sure.
Again, sort of like what's their function? So I guess there's the religious aspect, but it's also like, are they performing surgical like operations? Are they storing these instruments? It's quite like interesting.
Yeah, no, it's a curious addition. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, actually. It's not something I've seen much of in the missionary accounts which I've read. I mean, certainly there's an allusion to the making of remedies, but whether they're administering these, who they're administering these remedies to is left kind of rather vague. Whether there's a commercial function to this, whether they're involved with local trade, we're not too sure. There are so many clues, but not many answers. Elliot, did you have your hand up as well?
Yeah, I think they definitely have way more than they would need to survive. Like they have much more than like the bare necessities. Like they just need to live day to day. And also like when kind of building on what Samuel was saying, like with the Franks like traveling through and like staying and stuff, it kind of shows them as part of a network, like not just like kind of isolated individuals in a place that's quite alien to them. Yeah. It shows them as like quite integrated into the landscape around them. Yeah,
definitely. And I suppose on that last point, which I really like, that because we've touched on this slightly, their integration into local society. So on the one hand, we said, well, they were raided, they store weapons, though whether these are for trade or self-defense isn't totally clear, but certainly there's evidence of some tension there. But conversely, if we think about the objects themselves, what might that suggest about their relationship with local actors? If we think about the objects they possess, the nature of the objects. Does anyone want to pick up on that? Daniel, you've got your hand up. I don't know if you wanted to make that or a related point.
Well, on that point, there's the Turkish carpets and the Persian carpets that they use for decoration in the church. So it seems to be an integration of almost the church culture and also the local culture as well. Definitely, yeah, really interesting example of a kind of a hybrid culture there, which perhaps wouldn't be so acceptable or so common back in 17th century, or rather 18th century, excuse me, France. Got two others with their hands up. Let me have a look. Annabelle.
Yeah, I think what was really interesting as well, the idea about it being networks, was looking at who was giving them the gifts and where they'd got the wealth from.
Yeah.
So like looking at the links of the East India Company, the priests that have given them things, suggests that they're established and that they're well known about, and the connections they have with very influential people could maybe suggest that, yeah, their lives are connected, but also that maybe they're serving a purpose that isn't solely religious. Maybe there are greater links to trade or as a base for travellers, having like a foothold in Iraq potentially.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think this point about trade is a really important one. Certainly, when we I suppose instinctively, when we encounter a missionary document, or you know, we would assume that there would be more about religion almost, whereas this is almost, I don't know, it's almost a boast, as in look at all this wonderful stuff we have, you know, and some of it really is quite valuable, and there's not too much about religion comparatively speaking. Yes. Oh, plenty of hands up. That's really lovely to see. Hildalith, did you want to come in?
There's a quite specific thing about the units of measurement, in the sense that they're quite round numbers, mostly when we're looking at kind of, you know, 150 acres or 400, but so which kind of, yeah, increases the notion that this is a trade culture rather than just random things they happen to have, because they're kind of seem like transactional agreements that must be taking place, yeah, because they're quite purposeful numbers rather than random.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, and I particularly like that point about, you know, these being, you know, I mean, large numbers, round numbers, and that pointing to some kind of, you know, some kind of transactions are taking place. I mean, certainly what you guys are doing here is spot on. It's kind of, you know, you're pulling out these little threads of evidence and unraveling them and seeing where they lead. I mean, initially when we approach it, certainly we're struck by the number of items, and there's a sense that there are people passing through, and so our minds jump to trade. But it's also, but then it's about kind of reading it again and diving a little deeper and padding that evidence out. So padding, kind of fleshing it out. Again, really lovely to see so many hands. Who haven't we heard from in a while? Yeah, Charlotte, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think also from that point on number 6 about the AUKUS, you can actually compare that to point number 2, which talks about the French unit of currency. And I think that kind of, it shows that the person who's wrote this has used both terminology from like their native French country and also the Ottoman Empire. So it kind of insinuates that they have a kind of interconnectedness, and you know, like how identity and culture is like a malleable construct that is kind of like situated in geographic location, and they can, you know, adopt that through discourse as shown through the primary source.
Absolutely. No, this is spot on. I think it's something you see quite frequently in travelers' accounts from this period. You know, they're able to use different points of reference. So in this case, they're using a French unit of currency, and then you know, and then you know, without any kind of explanation, they switch to an Ottoman unit of currency. I mean, certainly in my own work, I come across, you know, for instance, travelers who are engaging with religious ideas that would have been very common to most 17th century Englishmen. You know, debates over, you know, kind of the right forms of worship, broadly speaking, but they'll make allusions to, you know, for instance, Islamic worship and Eastern Christianity, and so, you know, you're mixing kind of different forms of knowledge, so forms of knowledge that would have been very familiar to most of your contemporaries, most of your counterparts, but of course you have those unique experiences of travel, and therefore you're able to draw in some very, very different perspectives. I like that point a lot. Cool. Let's see. Yes. Should we bring in Elliot again?
Yeah. There's kind of with number 11 especially. There's kind of a disparity between how that's written and the surrounding context. So it says like they only have a few coins for daily expenses, but the whole document pretty much documents just how much wealth they have. So like that phrasing just kind of is quite interesting, because it kind of implies that they don't have a lot of money to spend day to day, and it kind of tries to paint them out as living quite frugally, whereas the rest of the document just shows the amount of wealth that they had.
What might be the point of that? That's a really good point. So if we look at point 11, they note that, you know, in the midst of all this material wealth, they only have a few coins for daily expenses, no more than 20 or 30 piastres.
Is it because they were like Catholic missionaries and they wanted to paint themselves out as like very holy, down to earth, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a really nice interpretation. Yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts on that? I mean, if we think about, I mean, this leads us on nicely to another point, actually. If we think about kind of who this source is written for, do we know who this source is written for? Harry, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at the top there, it talks about it being sent to the missionary headquarters in France. So I'm wondering whether it's maybe perhaps some sort of kind of like, I don't know, obviously kind of, come in, you know, kind of during a raid, kind of some sort of kind of like check almost, or kind of, you know, some kind of like, I don't know, some element of kind of like scrutiny or some kind of like reporting back to kind of the headquarters, if that makes sense.
Definitely, yeah. Sarah, do you want to come in?
I was going to say, just based on that point about it being sent to the missionaries in France, it also shows that a lot of that wealth might have not been for themselves. It might have been for the church, because it also says that the golden and silver fabric was for the church, wax for the church as well. So I think we're assuming here that wealth was theirs, but perhaps part of it was to send back to the church back in Europe.
Definitely, yeah. Anyone else? So we got so many hands up that I'm going to hand over to you guys, because there's a really, you know, these are really interesting points. So Hildalith, do you want to come back in?
I think there's something particular about what it is that is, maybe the fact, if we take that the missionaries are making this report of what's being seized, is there an ideology behind the things that are being seized, in the sense that are they taking these very rich objects to try and bring a more simple life to the environment, and then that would give us a distorted idea of what Baghdadi culture was like, because they're specifically taking away the things that they perceive to be so I mean, it's just a suggestion, but in the sense of thinking about the fact that what is seized specifically might have a theme to it, and then that might make us look differently at what we can know about Baghdadi society, the Iraqi society, from these things, because they might be misrepresentative in that sense.
Oh, great. No, we like suggestions. Annabelle, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, so thinking about their lives, when you look at item 11, the fact that they didn't have that much money on a daily basis, that could suggest that it wasn't actually that much of a stable existence. And then if we think about the fact that they talk about the mission in Mosul, and that was razed to the ground, and then again that their things are being seized, could suggest that this isn't stable, and this is almost potentially they were expecting this, and it's sort of it's definitely it's in an atmosphere of tension. There's definitely a lot of conflict going on.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to pick out. Oh, go on, Samuel, then.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to kind of make a point, just pulling together some of the things that have been said, because I think when you look at the contrast between what's been given for their daily expenses and then the fact that they have so many things for the church, like 11 medium-sized Turkish carpets and Persian carpets and candle wax and things like that, perhaps that does show an aspect of the kind of the purpose of all these grand things that they have, and of course it could be sent back to the church in France, but sent back to France, but it could also show something about the desire of portraying kind of what they're doing in a religious aspect, as it can almost attract people in by having all this material wealth and this kind of material grandeur for the church. So maybe there's a motive in that sense, drawing people to the church to kind of see these things and associating the religion with that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. I mean, I've always been really intrigued, actually, by point number, I've lost it now, point number 17, 11 medium-sized Turkish carpets and 3 Persian carpets for use in the church. I mean, what they mean by for use is disappointingly vague. I mean, it perhaps suggests more than decoration. Whether they're used in worship is a really interesting question, rather tantalizing actually, but it doesn't suggest necessarily that they are. It may still mean decoration, but definitely the sense that they're looking to attract people to the church is an interesting one. I mean, can we say anything more about, if we return to the question of, I mean, this returns us to the question of the missionaries' kind of relations with local inhabitants, local the Ottomans, the Ottoman authorities, local Iraqis. Did anyone else want to make that point? Daniel, you've got your hand up, so feel free to comment on that, or if you wanted to bring something new to the discussion, I'm happy to be led by you guys.
Yeah, well, my point was sort of going to be towards, although the document goes back to the missionaries in France, there also seems to be a connection with the French state, especially in point 22. Mr. Kerr, or I don't know the French pronunciation, he seems to be almost like a diplomat. You could sort of hypothesize with him being sent by King Louis XIV.
Yeah,
and maybe that these missionaries needed almost the security of the French state rather to protect them against the Ottomans, and the link that they play between the Ottomans and the French state. Yeah,
definitely, Mr. The traveller, Mr. Carré, definitely the sense that he forms a link, albeit an indirect one, between the missionaries and the state is a really interesting one. Okay, well let's pick up on that then, the relationship between the missionaries and the French state. Do we have any sense of do we have any? So that's a really nice starting point. Do we have any sense of that in the document? Daniel, you've got your hand up.
With the paintings, they've got the paintings of the King Louis XIV. It still seems to be, even though they have integrated with the Ottoman culture, there still seems to be an importance placed on the French aspect of the church and of Catholicism.
Yeah,
as
definitely.
well with the Virgin Mary.
Yeah, definitely a kind of link to home. Right, shall we? Oh yeah, Charlotte, I just saw your hand pop up.
Yeah, I was going to say, I also think it kind of shows what they value in terms of the relationship. They definitely have a kind of high status in the French community, and I think that's still reciprocated through their missionary household in the Ottoman Empire as well. So yeah, I think it's point 18, how Louis sent all these different things to the household, so they still have a close connection, and there's still communication going on there. So it just shows their kind of status and their importance, even through this kind of geographical distance as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Sarah.
I'm just going to bring up another point, something you were talking about before about their lives and who they kind of like communicated with. I can't tell a lot about their kind of relationship with the Ottomans, but I can tell that between themselves, the missionaries around the area, around the Ottoman Empire and around, would have communicated, because they've got books belonging to the household in Mosul, which indicates that they had some sort of communications with them over there. They received the sword from a priest and that kind of thing. So, and then obviously the utensils from the Franks. So while I'm not too sure about their relationship with like residents of the Ottoman Empire, it seems like the residents from home who had also settled there or traveling by, they were quite close with or had a certain connection with.
Yeah, definitely. It's just, I think Alicia, did you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of like their relationship with the society, we can maybe tell a lot from, I think it's I've lost the point. Point 8. So traveling Franks who had nowhere else to stay, and it says down here, so Franks was a word used to describe Europeans living in the Ottoman Empire. So that might suggest some hostility to Europeans in the Ottoman Empire, if the Franks who are traveling there have absolutely like nowhere else to stay but with their fathers. So I wonder if that can tell us about the lives of the missionaries themselves as as Europeans, what we can like gauge from that.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, again, there are all these lovely little clues and indications, but should we perhaps think more, because a lot of people are saying, oh, I'm not sure, but which is absolutely fine. I mean, sometimes a little bit of uncertainty is no bad thing. I mean, because it leads us on to thinking about some of the limits of this source and kind of what doesn't it tell us. I mean, it returns us to our fundamental question: how useful is this source for studying, the lives of missionaries in this period in Iraq? Annabelle, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting because we can see how the church has sort of accumulated all these different influences from France, and then from like the Turkish influences and stuff from Persia. But you don't really see what the church has then given back to the communities that they're interacting with. So there's one where it says a father's passed away there. So you can see that they have lived their lives there and they have clearly had interaction, but we're not quite sure if it goes both ways, just exactly what the exchanges were.
Yeah, that's a really nice point, and we're told far less about how the missionaries have impacted the society which they've encountered, and certainly that's something we always have to be wary of when we're reading European sources, Western European sources regarding the Islamic world. It's something I've grappled with in my own research, looking at travelers. Much of the time I'm looking at their diaries, I'm looking at their journals, I'm looking at their letters, and of course that provides us with a partial picture. But I think historians in the past have been guilty of using these sources in an attempt to understand the societies which these travelers encountered, and there are many examples of that. Samuel, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to make a quick point in terms of the limitations, and I think the source as a whole kind of leads you quite into a lot of speculation, simply because it doesn't tell you a lot about the purposes of things being given. For example, if you look at the last 2 points, it's talking about a rifle and 2 pistols, and it's talking about a Turkish sword, and just from looking at that, you could assume that it's for some sort of protection, but then we have no idea about that. We don't know whether it's simply that it has just been left in their care for other purposes. So I'd say, in the sense that we're given a source that's given an inventory, and because it's an inventory of things lost, they're not necessarily writing it to say what they were doing in their lives. They're writing it to say what has been taken from them. And I think there's that hole in the knowledge.
Yeah, it has this kind of functional purpose. Well, here's what we've lost, but I mean, the Turkish sword being given, they're hinting to, I don't know, some kind of culture of gift giving, but kind of why, or whether why those gifts were given, if indeed they were given as gifts, we don't know. Sarah, yes.
I was just going to make a point about their relationship with the Ottomans, and I guess you can assume that to some extent it was a good enough relationship to be able to live together harmoniously to some extent, because they had all those spices, they had items necessary for making remedies, and all these things I suppose they would have learned from a culture they adopted from the people around them, and if they were completely reclusive from them, they wouldn't have been able to adopt that as much. So I suppose while they might have not been as close to them, you can kind of assume that they were close enough with the Ottomans on a kind of like neighborly basis, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? Because I suppose conversely, I mean, the reason that this document was written in the first place was because a raid had taken place, which points to some tension, certainly. But I think you're absolutely right. I think certainly. I can't quite remember who it was. I apologise, but someone alluded earlier to a use of Ottoman terms fairly freely. Obviously they're trading quite widely with local people. That might the raid itself might suggest some tensions with the Ottoman authorities, but of course those who conducted the raid are not necessarily representative of those who are giving them the objects or who are trading objects. Yes. We haven't heard from Harry. Do you want to comment?
I was just I think I was going to make a pretty similar point to Samuel, really, so maybe I'll just kind of piggyback on the back of that. But I guess kind of the one, if I had to put like a fundamental limitation of the source out, is that we're trying to use the source to tell us things about the lives of the missionaries, but
Yeah.
like that wasn't the purpose of the source when the source was produced, if that makes sense. And so I think there's some really like kind of, we look at it with modern day eyes and think, for example, or the for example, the candles would be used for this because that's what they're used for in the modern day, but actually that could be completely wide of the mark and could be used for anything or everything.
Yeah, there's a danger of historical anachronism here, certainly, because I mean, many of these objects, I'd say most of them are to some extent familiar to us, and are still used in one form or another. And certainly, when we were talking earlier about surgical, medical, and mathematical instruments, I think with so little information about how they're actually used, we use our imaginations to fill that gap, I think, sometimes. Yes. Daniel, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I was going to talk about thinking about the production of the source again. There's a very personal nature to the way it's been produced. It says that we no longer use. So it's like there's a relationship between the person who's written this source and the objects themselves.
No, that's an interesting point about it's always a useful exercise to think about how the source is written. That sounds very basic, but certainly the perspective matters, and I think the use of we there, it is quite interesting, the use of that collective. Samuel, you're up.
Yeah, my point's really quick. It's just that I think the fact that it's an inventory of the things that were seized means that we still don't know the exact things that remain for them to kind of have. We don't know whether they are still kind of sitting on some other form of wealth. We do not know whether this is generally like pretty much everything that they had, and now they're essentially like paupers in the middle of a foreign land. We kind of don't know their current state, and I guess that leads into another aspect of what is missing in that, because it is an inventory. There's less. You don't really get to see their emotional state in what they're writing. You don't know whether they're writing from a state of kind of desperation, or whether it's just like a lax report of something that may happen relatively often. I guess there's also that.
Yeah, exactly. We don't know if they've been if they had been raided before. We don't know what they now possess, kind of what their function is now. Charlotte, do you want to come in?
I also think if we relate it all back to the religious aspect of it all, because I think it's quite interesting that they do state that they are Catholic missionaries, especially in the context that Iraq was a majority Muslim place as well. So the sense that this attack might be like an attack on faith, a kind of religious motivation behind it, and I think that also shows. Is quite telling in sense of the power dynamic in the Ottoman Empire as well, because it says in the introductory part that it was the authorities of the Ottoman Empire who were the raiders. So it shows that everything that was taken from them, did it have just a superficial meaning, or was it deeper in sense that it had a religious meaning as well, and was it an attack on faith?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. What was the role of faith in the raid, if any? Was there a religious context to this? I mean, the document says relatively little about religion, doesn't it? But certainly, we can't help but think about the role of religion in the 16th or rather 17th and 18th centuries, and the role of kind of religious conflict. I mean, certainly, I think this speaks to a broader point, which many of you have picked up on today, which is that, the missionaries. One thing that we can say about the lives of missionaries in Iraq in this period is that they occupy this curiously kind of liminal space, between Ottoman Iraq and between their home in France. On the other hand, there are objects attaching them to the French state and Catholicism and Louis XIV and so on. And yet there is certainly evidence, I think it's fair to say, of integration into local Ottoman culture, and I think we can think about the missionaries, as many historians do, of travelers in this period, as intermediaries almost, you know, between these two worlds, and they occupy this kind of uncomfortable position as a result. Cool. Let's have a look. Did anyone else want to come in? I mean, is anyone else? I mean, do you think this? I mean, if I were to ask another question about, which is perhaps a historiographical point, so a point which relates to how we study history, how we approach history, the sources we use. Does anyone want to comment on that? Does anyone feel that does this source feel new to anyone, in the sense that, you know, I mean, I don't know how many people are studying inventories here, but is it something that you come across a lot, or would you perhaps be more familiar with, say, a journal entry, or I don't know, perhaps you're very comfortable analyzing inventories or lists, but how does it differ from what you might be more familiar with as historians? What do you guys think? Yeah, Samuel.
Yeah, I think well, I know that personally I've definitely not read many inventories. I know exactly what you go towards for information like that normally, but I think it kind of does show something, especially in terms of place, especially if you're writing as a European historian and you're trying to find out about the lives of Europeans or just people living in continents that aren't your own. There's often you are led towards using certain sources, I feel, which may be just from situations where the person is not trying to tell you about their lives. They're not trying to tell you about what's happened in their day. They're just doing something of necessity, and from that, you know, that everyday document of necessity, you have to draw something about their everyday lives. So I think that's something that I guess historians will have to do, especially when writing about situations that are a lot more detached from their situation, where there may be a whole, you know, a large number of sources.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Harry, I think you had your hand up too.
Pretty basic point really, but I was just going to say that it kind of doesn't. I think it's quite good as a source, in terms of it's not detached. Okay, it's kind of quite detached in the way, whereas quite a lot of sources that you look at, there's quite an obvious kind of like political bias laying underneath it, or there's quite an obvious kind of motive for the author. And this, maybe it's just that that's not as clear in this instance and is there. But it still seems like quite a factual, you know, like we've said, we don't know. I think often you can learn more about what's omitted than what isn't there. And obviously we don't know that. But I think it is quite an interesting kind of like perhaps more balanced source, and quite a good source for a historian to work with, actually.
Yeah, perhaps less religiously, politically charged. Did anyone else want to come in on that? Yeah, Hildolith.
I was going to say, I was actually going to kind of say the opposite, in that kind of that side of things is maybe hidden, in that we don't have access to understanding who is writing the source and why they're writing the source, but there is still somebody writing the source for specific reasons, which might actually lead us to think that this is objective information when it's really not. So kind of the danger in that, and having kind of less information about the historical actors involved is kind of, but it's important to remember that they're still there producing this source.
Yeah. So I suppose that's an interesting point. We think of it as less religiously or politically charged because we don't know about, if I've understood you correctly, because we don't necessarily know about the people involved, or, you know, we might, I suppose, in some sense, if we're approaching this source for the first time, perhaps not knowing who it is initially, you know, helps us, because we don't necessarily ascribe motives, or, I mean, it can act as a hindrance as well, of course. Daniel, you're next.
Yeah, for me with the inventory, it's very similar, because even though the source was written in 1701, it's got more of a medieval feel, I think, with like when you deal with medieval history, it's a lot of object based. You have to rely on archaeology.
Yeah,
I think there's sort of a link between the objects in an inventory, and almost like, although you don't have the physical objects to deal with in this case, it feels very much similar to the same sort of skills that you have to deal with when looking at objects that you.
Yeah, no, this is a really good point, and it touches upon a very important historiographical point too. So a point about the study of history, how we study history, the sources we use, as I say. Material culture, you know, so the study of objects, you know, the study of objects physically, but also the study of how they're used, how people interact with them, how people trade them, what people think of them, the values that people ascribe to objects. These are all really important questions, and I think it's an exciting area of history now that's really grown over the last 10, 15 years, is the study of objects, and not just of written sources, as important as those are, but the study of each of these objects. And again, that might go back to I think it was you that, apologies if it wasn't, but I think it was you, Daniel, that made the point about we, and about people's relationship. So that, again, we're hinting. We would pad this out with we would try to see if there are any missionaries' accounts, but certainly material culture is a really kind of interesting, really interesting area of history that I'd all encourage you to look into if you haven't done so already. Giorgio Riello and Anna Herritzen have done some fantastic work on this. Yes, Annabelle, do you want to come in?
Yeah, it's pretty similar to the points, but it was just the fact that it is a lot harder to get a sense of the people behind the source. Like, we've got the idea that they're fathers and we don't know how old they are, we don't know how long they've been there, we don't know how many of them there are. So it's actually really difficult to get a sense of who they are from the source. I think that it kind of reminds me a bit of sources where you've got a scribe that's writing it. It's a lot harder to tell about them than what they're saying about other events that are going on.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it is a really kind of, it is elusive in that respect. I mean, not knowing kind of who is writing, how many people are writing. Yeah, definitely it poses all sorts of problems. So our original question: what does this extract reveal about the lives of missionaries in Iraq in this period? Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? So I suppose on the one hand, we focused on what this source does tell us, and we spoke about how missionaries occupy this unusual space between France and the Islamic world, between Catholic France and Ottoman Iraq. There is evidence of integration into local culture. So, for instance, the use of medium-sized Turkish carpets and Persian carpets in the church. But then, of course, there are some items which tie these missionaries back to their homeland, back to their faith. So we spoke about pictures of the Virgin Mary, pictures of King Louis XIV. We spoke about the missionaries' involvement in local trade. We spoke about this site as a kind of way station for people moving through. I think that's a really interesting element of this source. This sense of movement, this sense of fluidity and mobility, I think is really interesting, and I think it speaks to some really interesting historiographical trends to do with global history, to do with microhistory to an extent. So the use of very specific sources to explore wider themes. So the role of travel, for instance, in 18th century in the 18th century in 18th century Iraq. But we also spoke about what this source doesn't tell us, and certainly we identified many limitations. We don't know who wrote it. We know why, because there was a raid, but we don't know much more than that. There's only so much we can say about the relationship of the missionaries to these objects. Certainly, there's only a limited amount we can say about their relations with local actors. Certainly, as I say, it suggests an element of integration and also conflict because of the raid itself. But also, apart from that, I don't think any Ottoman individual is mentioned or any kind of local traveller. And in that sense, it paints a fairly isolated picture almost of the mission. And then we talked about we talked about the source more broadly from a historiographical perspective, its relationship with global history, its relationship with material culture, and some new trends within the, not new anymore so much, but certainly some exciting trends in history that have been kind of developed and applied to the early modern period.